Dale Watts, former high school teacher at Booker T, among other places, and our purveyor of books at the All Souls bookstore, where you may purchase a signed copy of Connie Cronley's A Life on Fire. Take it away, Dale.
Thank you. I'm here to introduce Connie Cronley, and of course she's a Tulsa writer, and she has published 3 books of essays and co-authored a memoir with the late Edward Perkins, a career Foreign Service officer. Her newest book, of course, is A Life on Fire, Oklahoma's Kate Barnard. She's also a regular columnist for Tulsa People magazine and for Life Senior Services Vintage News magazine, a regular book reviewer on KOTV's Noon News, and a commentator on Tulsa Public Radio. She's also was the executive director of Tulsa Ballet Theater and Iron Gate Soup Kitchen. So, Connie, welcome aboard here.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, All Souls, for inviting me.
I just want to ask, I'm looking through and, of course, reading the book, asking about how long it took you and basically what prompted you to select Kate Barnard for this book.
Well, I love the title of this book, A Life on Fire, because that was her life. She was a fiery politician and social reformer. And I think she is the most important woman in state history. And the question is, why have we never heard of her? And that's one of the things this book answers, why we don't know of her. If we do know of her, we hear that she was the first woman elected to state office in Oklahoma. Before women could vote, that was in 1907, that was 15 years before women could vote. She couldn't even vote for herself. And that she was elected as the Commissioner of Charities and Corrections. And all of that's true. But that is a noun. That's what she was. And I think the important thing about her life is a verb, what she did. She devoted her life to social justice and political activism through her elective office. She campaigned and got laws written in Oklahoma for child education, compulsory education, against child labor, for criminal justice reform, most especially the juvenile court, one of the most important laws of our land. She worked for compassionate mental health care, and she was teaching the superintendents of those 2 state hospitals. So it's an old-fashioned notion that mental illness is caused by possession of the devils. That was a prevailing thought, and they would be beaten. And for compassionate, reformative care of prisons, jails and prisons. She said they should be reformed, not just punished. So those are the things she campaigned for and worked to establish in this state. Those are very important foundational elements. And she helped get most of those into the constitutions, the Constitutional Convention. And when the Constitution was passed and Oklahoma became a state, more news people, and it was all print then, gathered in Guthrie for this election of the Constitution. And the British ambassador said, this is a greater Constitution than the Constitution of the United States. And the national media said, the eyes of the nation are on this baby state because it has been established on such progressive foundations. So we might ask ourselves, what happened?
I'm sure she did at the point.
So you ask how I got involved in this. 1,000 years ago, when I was working at the University of Tulsa, Dr. Angie DeBow came to speak. Guy Logston brought her. And I was sitting at the very back of an auditorium when she spoke. This tiny woman with a fluff of white hair could barely see over the podium. And she spoke with such power and integrity about writing history and the importance of being accurate and the dedication to the craft. And I don't even remember what else she said, but I was the last one to leave. I was so taken with the power of what she was doing with her career. And I wrote her a fan letter. She lived in Marshall, and we began corresponding, and she invited me over, and we became friends. for the rest of her life, for the last 20 years. I was about 35 and she was 85, and she was my mentor. But mostly we talked about writing, her great Oklahoma history books and Native American histories, and the most important one, And Still the Waters Run. And when she was talking about that book, she talked about doing some research on Kate Barnard. I've never heard of Kate Barnard. And she said, I wish you would write her biography. And in the folly of youth, I said, okay, I will. And she said, the way to start is to track my footnotes in And Still the Waters Run, which is easier said than done. But I started doing that research. And I'm so glad I started back then, because I went to places that she had been. I went to the Oklahoma City, to the Department of Libraries and Western History Collection. I went to Washington, D.C., to the National Archives. I went, when I started, some of the people who knew Kate were still alive. That's what's so lucky that I started it then. This was 50 years ago. So I met the son of her important assistant. I met the daughter of her important lawyer, investigator, who happened to live in Tulsa and go to my church, Trinity Church, and who was married to John Gold, who was an editor of the Tulsa World. I had correspondence with a reporter in Oklahoma City who was on duty the night that Kate died in 1930. So if we start research today, I would have missed those opportunities. And there was Dr. DeBow guiding me, go here, go read that, go do that. But then life got in the way. I started writing it. I had all of these bankers' boxes of notes, 9 bankers' boxes of notes, and put them away. And then after I retired from Iron Gate about 5 or 6 years ago, I pulled them out and said, now's the time to finish writing the book. So I had that research done, and then the newest, to see what had been written and researched since then, and finished it. And that makes it sound a lot easier than it was, but that's the way it happened.
I noticed that you had said on one of your things that you 50 years, and I thought, well, did I write that down wrong? But no, 50
years.
Oh, my gracious.
Doesn't seem possible, does it?
No, but it's well worth it, I must admit.
I hope Dr. DeBow looks down and says, well done, I'm glad you told the story. She wanted people to know. Kate Barnard was her idol, and she heard Kate Barnard speak when Angie DeBow was a young teacher. She heard Kate speak at a teacher's meeting, and so she could describe to me what kind of speaker she was. And her public speaking was one of her great gifts, and it's what made her career. And Dr. DeBow said you could hear a pin drop. People leaned forward to hear her. Now, Kate was very tiny, just 5 feet tall, 90 pounds. But she had a voice, Dr. DeBow said. She said it was magical and mesmerizing. She said Amy Semple McPherson had that gift. FDR had that gift. But somehow Kate's voice, she had the ability to project. She spoke to audiences of 8,000 or 9,000, 3,000 regularly. And this was, 1907, long before microphones.
None of these microphones.
And they could hear her. But Dr. DeBow said it was just mesmerizing. So I hope that I've been able to capture in the book the power she had over audiences, because that was a great gift.
Yes, I've noticed in the book that when you were mentioning that, I thought, this small lady is talking to thousands of people without the aid of any kind of amplification of her voice. So this is truly how she managed to.
It's a gift.
It's a gift, that's for sure. Why is it that, why has she been so overlooked? What do you think? Is it just.
Well, if you think about what she was campaigning for, it was things that the state really wanted at that time. We wanted to be a progressive state. It became a state as a working man's state. We wanted living wages for the union men, the railroaders, the coal miners. We wanted safe working conditions, 2 exits to a mine inspector, a factory inspector, Kate's big issue was child labor, and the state was all for that. We will not put our children in the mines and in the factories. But then it was such a great idea, but it became costly, all the things she wanted. It was a new state, and taxes had to be raised, and this began to cost things. And some of the people said, it takes 2 people working to pay for every elected politician we had. So there's a little grumbling about the cost. Yes, we wanted a mental health hospital, but that costs. Yes, we wanted a prison built, but that cost. So it was at the expense of the reality. That's one reason. Kate made a lot of enemies everywhere she went because she did not go in demurely saying, would you please make these changes? Would you please take down the shackles from the prison? Would you please stop beating the mental patients that you've put in a wooden crib? She would go in lambasting. This will be done and that will be done and I will be back in 30 days. So she didn't make a lot of friends. That was the second reason. She was an aggressive, outspoken woman. But the third reason, the big reason we don't know about her, is that in 1910, she was asked by our US senator and by the Indian district agents in Oklahoma to come to the aid of Indian orphans, mostly in orphanages, who were there wealthy. They had estates worth millions of dollars. And because they were orphans, they had to have a legal guardian. The guardian was appointed by the county judge, and this was open market on graft. And all of their estates were being stolen and squandered, and they were left poverty-stricken. So Kate had the only office with the legal power to come to their defense and reclaim their estates for them. She threw the power of her office into that. And you talk about making enemies, because there was vast conspiracy, and that's what did her in.
In the book, I was amazed when we got to those parts because, as I said, we've been made aware of some of this sort of thing with the Killers of the Flower Moon and the creation of the FBI to solve the Osage murders. But, you know, with her, it's like, okay, this started long before that ever made national news.
Yes, it was all over this. She investigated cases all over this part of the country, which is the old Indian territory, but she also sent her investigator into Osage Nation long before Killers of the Flower Moon, that period was set, long before the FBI was there. And he reported, this is a terrible situation here.
So Kate had to deal with men and women who felt she didn't know her place, I think.
She did not know her place.
Gloriously, she did not know her place. My reaction to all this was, we haven't seemed to progress much in how society deals with powerful women. And how did she deal with that had to affect her in some way, as she was running up against these people all the time.
It had to weigh on her, but she had such a strong sense of mission that she was going to do this and meant to do this, and she wasn't doing it for herself. Her biggest concern was for the children. And she said once later in her life, everything she did was for the child. Working wages so the family was stable. Education so the child could be education. Child labor law so that we don't put the children down in the mines and in the factories. She was very concerned about the child of the poor and said, what can we do about these children to prepare them, to help them make their way in this world? So laws to protect them. She dressed very plainly. This is an early picture of her before statehood. She dressed very plainly in dark clothes, never wore jewelry, maybe a cameo or a cross. And she said, this is the famous quote, how can women wear diamonds when babies cry for bread? So you ask, how did she handle with this conflict? She just stormed through it. She just ignored it and went on. she got a lot of criticism, especially when she was starting from, let's see, what was it? The Women's Christian Temperance Union. And it was a big kerfuffle in the newspaper. They said she was too outspoken. She consorted with that dreadful police matron. She was overbearing. And what Kate read that to mean, I think, was she wasn't ladylike. And I think she read it as criticism of her own poverty. She was virtually an orphan. She was a Catholic in a Protestant country. She was poor. She did have a father who was gone most of the time. She boarded with people on a homestead. So I think she thought they looked down on her because she wasn't what she called club ladies. But people always ask her, how can I do what you do? How can I start social reform in my community? How can I do this? And her advice was, have as few women in your organization as possible. She said, if they give you a bag of old clothes, they will think they've done a good thing. And they want to interfere and run the thing. She said, get men involved because they've got the money and they've got the power. And that's true. That was true. Now, that doesn't, she's criticized now because she was initially not wholeheartedly supportive of women's suffrage. Not that she didn't approve it. She said, I have my own issues. I've got more than I can handle right now. You have a women's suffrage movement. You do that. She changed her mind about that later. But she had great admiration for the women social justice at that time. Florence Kelley, Jane Addams, Ida Tarbell, the great muck writer, wrote her a fan letter. So she liked the women in the business that she was in, who were doing the work she was in. She was very involved and started a lot of women's union organizations, the International Union Label Committee, the Women's Anti-Child Law. She started all of these committees for unions, for child, and put them in the gallery at the Constitution when she spoke. So she was not anti-women. She was not anti-suffrage. She was all for Kate and her mission.
Yeah, she was focused on that. So much of this may have been due to her, you mentioned her upbringing and the poor situations, right? She was born in Kansas, am I correct?
She was born in Nebraska, and moved to Kansas, to Kerwin, Kansas, with her father, her mother, and her mother's two sons from an earlier marriage. And then her mother died in childbirth when Kate was not quite 2. And one of her earliest memories, she said, was the snow-covered cemetery burying her mother. And the baby died a few days later. And the father, John P. Barnard, could not raise children alone. So the 2 boys went to live with the grandparents, and Kate was left in Kerwin because the father was then surveying for the railroad and he was off. So she boarded with different families. This had to be hard. And she said many nights she cried. She was dramatic, cried herself to sleep because other children had mothers to love them. Now, when I was doing the book, she left diaries, a diary, sort of not a, today I did. She was writing her autobiography, and she left detailed, she had health problems, severe health problems, detailed medical records, the conditions, the symptoms, what she'd saw. And I talked to 2 doctors in Tulsa about some of those records. And Dr. Robert Hudson, who was a pediatrician at the time, said, cannot overestimate the influence of her mother's death on her, that it directed probably her whole career. It was all about helping somebody who needed help,
Same
helping
situation.
children. He said, a mother loss is one of the greatest wounds that anybody could suffer. And that's one of the things that drove her.
I can see, yes, that would be. The idea that was Oklahoma was considered a progressive state.
I know, we will
seems-
laugh our sides sore with that
We try
today.
not to, I try not to, okay. But I do realize that the state constitution was a populist
Yes, populist document.
document, and they elected every office. And we've struggled with that in recent years because so much of that's going on. But, you know, she had lost so much support by the 1930s. And I mean, it's really interesting how that all switched, didn't it? I mean, it went from
Well-
progressive to more concerned, like you said, about the money and how we're going to pay for things.
It was the money. And it was the fourth legislature that drove her out of office. And there was such a conspiracy of graft and corruption. And that's what she and her department were discovering when they were trying to help the Indian orphans. And it reached from the lowest county, smallest town, all the way to Washington, and to oil companies in the East. And it was such a powerful graft and conspiracy. She said it was like being swept up in the ocean. She and her little office didn't stand a chance. And of course, then she lost the power of the press behind her because these names were too powerful to name, like Rockefeller. So she was the fourth legislature was so vicious, not just to her, to all state agencies then, but especially to her, because a lot of them had their fingers in the till and they wanted the money. And they wanted to eliminate her office, but they couldn't do it because it had been established by the Constitution. But what they could do was cut her funding. And that's what they did. So she lost an assistant, she lost an investigator. She was just her and her secretary, and reduced salary and reduced, maybe not salary, but reduced printing, reduced travel expense. And it was hopeless.
Yeah, I've been part of the book. They would become upset with her because she traveled to national conventions and sent people
Yes.
to learn how to do better.
To learn. She toured prisons to learn how we should build our state prison when we
Right.
were building at McAllister. She toured New York mental hospitals to learn how we should be treating our people here. She was so popular. She was called in the press the good angel of Oklahoma. And because of her speaking ability, she was offered professional speaking engagements on the Chautauqua circuit, and the Lyceum circuit. And she said, no, my work is in Oklahoma. But she was asked to speak at national conventions of all kind, and she did. She was asked to go on the stump in 5 eastern states for William Jennings Bryan when he ran for president, the only woman to campaign for him. She called him Billy. And Teddy Roosevelt stopped a receiving line in Washington to meet her and thank her for her work. She was so popular and the most powerful politician. So that's one reason for her downfall. One of the people she worked with was Judge Lindsay in Denver, and he was the father of juvenile court. He created that, and he came to Oklahoma. She brought all these experts in over and over to help write the laws, to help lobby for them, to push them through. And he said that he saw the power she had, the influence she was making, and he said, I knew then she was a marked woman. She was standing between the grafters and the money, and she had to go. And she had bad health, and ruining her career and her department broke her heart. And she lived many years as a recluse, very sick, died alone in a hotel in Oklahoma City, but she was vowing to regain her health and run for U.S. Senate. So she was a fighter to the end.
Well, that all had to wear down on her. I see that in the book where you're talking about the fact that, just this constant struggle and stress to just maintain that office.
And in campaigning,
Yes.
always out in horse and buggy and cars
Yes.
and trolleys and rain, speaking on the street corners and in hotels. I mean, just the stress and the hard work. It was just hard work and constant pressure. No, we're not changing. No, No, we're going to beat the prisoners. No, we're going, one of the things her job, as mandated by the Constitution, was to inspect every
Yes.
charitable jail, hospital, school in the state, 320 of them. I mean, that's a big job.
With one assistant, right, or something, I think.
With one, started with one secretary and one assistant. And she wouldn't just go in and look around, she would tear the place apart. She would taste the food. She would check the mattresses. She was always worried that the people were cold. And I think that circles back to that image of the child, of being a child and seeing her mother buried in that snow-covered grave. So she insisted. The jails and the city and county jails were so awful, they were medieval. She found a hog in the jail with some people. It would be a tiny room, half the size of this, jammed with prisoners so tight they couldn't lie down. Or if they had bedding, it was a mattress on the floor. In the mental hospitals, bedding might be a straw mattress that was wet from the rain. And the patients put to bed because they would soil themselves naked. I mean, these were the conditions. So the emotional stress on her was overpowering too, not just the physical work, the emotional stress. One of her most important accomplishments was getting the juvenile court so that children were not incarcerated with adults. And when she started, there were 10-year-old children or 8-year-old children in jail with convicted felons and adults. And she talked once about reaching through the bars and patting a little 10-year-old boy on the chin and said, "What are you in here for, Sonny?" And he just burst into tears.
Can imagine.
So the conditions, and I think of it as ancient history, but she was my grandfather's age. It wasn't that long ago.
And,
We do have a question from the audience.
okay,
Wondering, what was her position on Jim Crow laws, the first laws passed in the Oklahoma legislation? Do you have any information about that? And Dale, if you could repeat the question.
okay. We have a question about the Jim Crow laws and how that was she aware of any of that or trying to deal with any of that sort of thing?
The Jim Crow laws, thanks to Alfalfa Bill Murray, were some of the first passed by the Constitution, in the Constitution. She and Murray clashed ferociously. She did not take a stand on it, although she said publicly, she said, she was very liberal. She said, "I personally would like to see all people of any color, black, white, yellow, red, to live together. But I know I am far advanced, and most of my state people do not agree with me." And boy, was that an understatement. They did not.
Yeah. She was such an easy target for them, wasn't she?
Yes.
She didn't realize it, I don't think, but she was setting herself up.
The Jim Crow laws was one of the problems she had with laws for children. So she would go in and realize in an inspection that they were not honoring the laws for child justice. They were still trying them in an adult court. No, they would not separate the children from the adults in jail. No, this has to be separated. And she would stand while there were separate facilities built. And then she would find that they had put a black child in with white children, and that had to be changed too. So she encountered this. It made her job harder, because these were the laws that she was living by. So she had to make more separate conditions, accommodations.
It's Kate's conflict with the criminal justice system in Oklahoma and dealing with Indian legal cases. So now we have the McGirt ruling, and it's kind of interesting. How do you think she would deal with what's gone on where we're reestablishing, or actually they never disestablished the reservations?
She was from the west side of the state, Oklahoma Territory. And when she was asked to investigate the Indian cases, what was called the Indian problem, capital letters, she said, "I don't know anything about Indians. Who are these children?" And that's when, because that wasn't an issue on the west side, and was horrified at what she discovered. She was she believed that the law should be observed. So with McGirt, I think she would agree with the Supreme Court justice who said, nations like great men keep their word. Yeah. And the treaties were broken. Yeah. And so it was upholding the law for the allotments of the Indian orphans and minors that she was trying to maintain. Because this would have been billions of dollars in today's money. And she saw that it was being stolen illegally. So.
Yeah, even though there was, Jim Crow in effect with the Indian population itself. I mean, they were also treated as less than equal.
And it's so easy to say how the biggest problem was that the legislatures, and especially in Washington, wanted to remove restrictions because the allotted land, especially by full bloods or even mixed bloods, could not be leased or sold without approval of the federal government officials or their guardian. And it's easy to say now, that was the law. 2 treaties had been broken. They were allotted this land twice. First, as Angie wrote, as long as water runs. Secondly, that was taken away and they were allotted individual allotments, and now that was being taken away. And yet, and it's hard to say, another side was not the grafters and the greedy, scrupulous people who wanted the money for themselves. There were the people who justified it maybe by saying, Indian land can't be taxed. We need land tax so we can build schools and roads. There were those who said, full bloods do not care about land ownership. They are doing nothing with their homesteads. We will improve it. We will bring progress. Now, isn't this something we hear all the time? It's for the good of the whole. It's for progress. Yes. But the same thing could be said about, the same argument can be said about child labor. Nobody said, let us brutalize our children by putting them in factories and warehouses and down in mines. The fact was that with the Industrial Revolution, changed the agrarian society, mobs of people moved to the city where the conditions of living and work were intolerable and unhealthy and could not make a living wage. Men would work 80 hours a week and still could not feed their families. And so what solution was there for these families but to put the children to work? That is not we do not excuse that. That is why. It wasn't that we don't care about our children, it's that we're trying to do this for the good of the family and feed.
And she got some feedback, blowback, I should say, rather, with the agricultural side, because I can imagine to have the kids working on the farm, and they didn't want to get into this business.
My gosh, this is where she and Alfalfa Berry clashed.
Oh, yeah.
And it was all about child labor laws, which did not pass the first legislature, which shocked her. He was adamantly opposed to it because he was a cotton farmer, and he thought, now see if we don't recognize this argument. We don't need the government to tell us how to raise our children. We know best. And besides, we need the children to work on the farm during harvest. So there was pushback about education, compulsory education, and what the law passed eventually called for was for children under the age of 16 to attend school 3 months a year. But the drama of that the child labor. So every little increment she made was, just a battle and a push against, we need the children in the fields. We need them in the...
I loved the quote. You quoted Balzac in the book. Behind every great fortune lies a great crime, and of course I loved it because it was also Tozo used it in the great mafia stories with The Godfather. But your book exposes so much of this corruption, the racism, and the graft, as well as noting many of the founders and noted men of Oklahoma who participated in those activities. Have you heard any comments with the publication of your book with naming of those names?
When Dr. DeBow wrote, "And Still the Waters Run," And she named names of people who were unscrupulous and crooked and stealing the money. And she named so many names, it threatened to destroy the University of Oklahoma press because those men were alive and powerful, and some on the state regents board. So she pulled her manuscript, which was a huge concession. It was hard times. But she said, the state needs a press more than it needs my book. So the head of the OU Press held the manuscript for 5 years, and when he went to Princeton, it was one of the first books he published. And she said, after all of that drama, what will people say? We'll be sued. She said, not a peep. She said, I did not hear a peep of criticism. And she said the reason, she thought, was because she knew so much more that she could have told.
Yes.
So I have named some names in my book. And what I have found is the one name around here that causes more ire than any, if you dare criticize him, is Charles Page. Because he did do a wonderful thing and had the Charles Page Orphanage and Home for Widows, great things, and people revere him. And yet, the way he got his oil money, his leases, was not always honorable. And yet, J.D. Colbert, who does great research in the allotments in this part of the state and in this part of the city, said that the reason that there were so many orphanages in Creek Nation with Creek children is because they warehoused the orphans with money, and Charles Page then would auction them off. Here's one who's 17, coming up 18. Got one over here, 16. Both J.D. Colbert and Russell Cobb, and I think others, are doing a lot more research in the family, in the town fathers, in the city fathers. And I think we will be reading more scandalous stories in the near future, naming names. But when I was writing my book, I talked to two people. I talked to two great Indian scholars, Renard Strickland, who is an Indian law and historian and writer, and he said very diplomatically, he said all the great towns, all the great buildings, all the great museums in Oklahoma came from oil money. In Oklahoma, you don't have money without oil, and in Oklahoma, you don't have oil without Indians. That was diplomatic. Now, Dr. Garrick Bailey at TU was a little more blunt, and I quote him. He said, what was going on in Osage County, he's an Osage scholar. He said, all of the oilmen knew what was going on and looked the other way or participated.
It's,
We are standing on stolen land.
Yes.
And that's the truth of the fact. And how much we want to acknowledge that, or do we? But this is an era where we're doing the Me Too movement. We're trying to, if not change history, really look at history and say, what can we learn? What can we do differently? What was done wrong?
Yeah.
And name names. Yeah. I don't know what we're going to do about Mount Rushmore.
Well, I mean, it ties into all of this, as I said, as a former teacher, this idea of you don't want me to teach things because it might upset some youngster. I said, that's the point.
How can you not?
You
Right.
have to teach the history. And yeah, we did some terrible things, but let's own up to it and move on. Because
We did some good things.
And we did a lot of good things, too.
And terrible things.
Yes.
And two things can be true at the same time.
That's so
let's-
true. I think they call that cognitive dissonance, where you can't do that. Angie DeBoe's book on Oklahoma history was used by so many school systems. So were Kate's contributions, I haven't read any of that. Did she include a lot of Kate's stuff in some books, you think, of her material?
I haven't read the books, the DeBoe books that they use in schools. I think those are more like History of the Indians of the United States and History of the Indian Tribes.
Okay.
But when I saw her speak at TU, there were several busloads of Native American children that were brought to hear her. And they stood in the aisles to greet her, and she stood to greet each and every one. And they just loved her. So whatever she had written about their heritage, they loved.
Well, question. Did she ever marry, and what were her views on marriage?
She did not marry. She never married. She never had children. She never wanted, I talked with a woman who lived in the homestead out by Neowalla, by Oklahoma City, who bought Kate's homestead, who knew people who lived around, and said around her when she was 18 and living on the homestead, she would never have anything to do with the boys. She wanted a career from the beginning. And I think she saw what it did to her mother and her grandmother. She saw how that hard lifestyle wore people down. The first career she wanted was to be a school teacher. That was one of the grandest things you could be. And she became a school teacher. But I'm not sure that was a good fit for her. And one researcher at the time diplomatically said her great energy to do something important overflowed that tiny schoolroom. So then she went to business school and studied stenography, shorthand and typing. That was very modern at the time, and that fit her. She wanted to be a modern woman, and those speedy skills fit her. She was good at it, and she had no trouble finding a job. She had a lot of trouble keeping a job because her bosses said this modest little black-haired woman would come in, and before you knew it, she was changing everything and telling everybody what to do and tried to run the whole show. So when she found social reform, and that was what was sweeping the nation. And here was the chance not to help just one thing or one person or a puppy, but to help the whole country. She found her heart, and she embraced it with all of her soul.
Yeah. So was she ever threatened physically from any of this? Did you discover anything? Maybe she was afraid of the forces that were coming against her by any chance? Because I can't imagine facing all this and not being somewhat concerned about her own safety.
She should have been, because the lawyer in her office was shot at several times.
Oh.
And during the campaigns that she was in, it was bare knuckles politics, and there were brawls in the street and in the hotel lobbies. And she was right there with it. She said, at that time, being fighting Irish was a proud thing to be. And she said, I'm Irish and love a good shindy. So she didn't back down like this, but she wasn't physically involved in it. I think what wore her out, she might be what we might in this day diagnose her as slightly bipolar and manic depressive, because she would push herself so hard beyond her energy and then collapse. And she had underlying health problems and would have to go to bed for a day or a week or a month, and then off to retreats hospitals for weeks and months.
I noticed that, yeah. She would do
So it wore her down.
You used a word that I was going to ask you about, shindy, S-H-I-N-D-Y. So
It means a messy fight.
Oh, okay, because I thought shindig, and I thought, well, I don't
Not
think that's
shindig,
what...
shindy. She
Shindig.
meant a messy fight. I love a good fight, a good fight. She loved a good debate, strong debate.
Yeah, yeah. So we were talking about this earlier before we came on, and any thoughts about maybe would be happy if this were made into a movie so we could promote her some more?
People who read the book say, when is the movie coming out? Because her life is so colorful. To start from orphan and to do what she did, to campaign, to speak to thousands, to meet the president, to help when she investigated Lansing Prison in Kansas, because that's where the state prisoners were being sent before we built a prison. And that was a huge blow up in the press when she investigated that and saw how they were treated. And when they brought back a train, what was called the train full of convicts, brought them back at night from Kansas. It was so bad. And they cheered, our Kate, all the way. So everything she did was cinematic. It lends itself to a movie. When I was doing the research, the pictures I've seen from her, she looked to me like the English actress Helena Bonham Carter. petite,
Yes.
a lot of hair, big dark eyes, fiery. I would love to see a movie of her life made. I would like more people to know of her life.
Well, Oklahoma has a growing film industry
certainly
coming
have.
on.
Let's hold
Let's
a
keep
good
our
thought.
fingers crossed that works. So, okay, I have to ask this question.
Did you run into any obstacles with researching Bernard's work on guardians, grifters, and orphanages?
Any kind of opposition in your research on the grifters and all the?
For me?
Yes.
Did I have obstacles? No, because most of the materials I was working with existed in her life.
In her-
And the first draft I sent to OU Press would have been a book twice the size it is now. And they said, that's too much. And it's because she wrote so prolifically. As she wrote annual reports, she was mandated to write annual reports for her department. And instead of a little cursory report, she went in detail of what she saw. And at that time, the orphanages could be very candid. And they would say, Mary Smith, 13, seems mentally soft, robust. I mean, they would give all the details of their health and their mental state.
In the language of that time.
In the
Yes.
language of that time.
Yes.
But she reported a lot of that. And when they were doing trials for the Indian orphans and the legal cases, the tribal land, she ran the testimony. She put all of this in her annual reports and put a copy on every legislator's desk. The conditions she found and what they said.
That irritates some people. I
That
guess.
irritated people.
Another question.
What's next on your writing agenda?
Yeah, that's how my question was coming up. What are you get ready for another book already?
Oh, another book. I can't do another book. Right now, I'm just talking about Kate, giving talks, talking about the book. I don't have a book in mind, I don't think. I like writing my essays for Tulsa People and commentaries and book reviews. Now I'm just kind of catching my breath, I think.
I would imagine after 50 years, it would be time. I'm going, I mean, it is amazing to think that you invested that much time, but I am so glad that you have, because you've introduced me to a woman. As I said, if I were still teaching, I'd be talking about this book, because.
Thank you. That's what we want educators to say.
Yes, they need to make sure they're doing that.
Was Barnard Elementary School named after her?
No, that was Henry Barnard, but he was another educational person.
You're the one person that knows that.
Yeah, it's. I thought so too. I must admit, I thought, because I taught at Hamilton, which was right next door to Barnard. But
No,
no,
Barnard School is not named for her.
No.
And neither is she related to the Chapman Barnard big ranching family.
No.
There was a school named for her during her lifetime.
Oh.
Some little town, I can't remember where, and I don't know if it's still there.
I'm glad you mentioned the pronunciation, because I started asking. Now we'll make sure we're saying Barnard correctly, but
Barnard.
not Barnard. And so
I think it's Barnard, right?
Okay, well, I'll go with that too. And so that's bad. But we do have a statue of her. And I think I sent you a photo. I hope we can get that up. But it's in the state capitol building on the first floor. And I'm so glad, because I thought, surely we've done something to memorialize this woman, other than just maybe some gravesite somewhere. But it's amazing, because she needs to be promoted.
When she died, her grave was unmarked for like 40 years.
Oh, dear.
The first portrait of a woman that was hung in the state capitol was the portrait of Angie DeBow. I was involved in that with publicity and things. And Dr. DeBow said what an honor it was. Charles Banks Wilson did the portrait.
Oh, yes.
And it's good.
Yeah.
And she said she was such an honor, but it should have been an honor that went to Kate Bernard, because she's the one who deserved it.
Amazing. And I think we are. Any other questions?
We've told
coming?
everything we know and then
I think
some.
so. We're at that point. If there's nothing more from Shannon, Connie, it's been wonderful. I'm so
Thank
glad to
you.
meet you, and it's been wonderful reading your
Thank you.
book.
You've
and
done
sitting-
such a good job. You did your homework,
Well,
sir.
I try to, and as I said, I hope that you guys all go out and buy the book. It's on sale, I know, in many places, and we will have them here. I'm
Here.
hoping maybe I can get you to sign some of those.
I signed them, yes.
Oh, they're already signed, so put that away, and we'll see you maybe at the bookstore sometime. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all souls.